39-year-old William Wallace and 26-year-old Giselle Preston appeared to be any ordinary couple living in Anaheim, California. They met in 2008, only a few months after Giselle's second child was born. On the surface, their relationship seemed great. Giselle would often post on Facebook how much she loved her husband, with posts such as, "My husband and I had a beautiful day yesterday, lovebirds for life," and "I love my baby so much." However, later events would assume Giselle was fronting about their relationship, as it was far from happy. Giselle was in the process of taking college classes in hopes of becoming a domestic violence counselor, a dream that was unfortunately birthed from her own trauma. Although William seemed to be a good dude on the surface, he was actually a horrible person. He had started abusing Giselle relentlessly starting only 2 months into their relationship. After the first round of abuse, Giselle called her best friend who took her to her mother's house. There she told them that William had beaten her. In fact, she was completely unrecognizable to her mother initially, as her eyes and cheeks were swollen, parts of her hair had been pulled out, and she had a bruised nose, 2 black eyes, and marks on the side of her neck. Another episode occurred in July of 2008. Giselle was taking a bath when William barged into the bathroom drunk, and he began to yell at her. After getting out of the bathtub, William grabbed her by her hair and began slamming her head against the bathroom wall. He dragged her into the bedroom, threw her on the floor, and began strangling her, saying that he was going to kill her. She began to pass in and out of consciousness while also attempting to fight back by scratching William in his face and torso area. He would eventually let go, causing Giselle to run into the room of her infant child, grab him, and escape the apartment. She immediately phoned up the police, but once they arrived, William had already fled the scene. However, he returned the following day, and police were already anticipating his arrival, so he was arrested shortly after. He pleaded guilty to misdemeanor domestic violence and spent 19 days in police custody in July of 2008. Giselle was also placed under a domestic violence protective order, which would completely prohibit William from having contact with her. Although later that year in November, he would spend 2 years in jail for a drug offense and burglary, and shockingly, while he was in police custody, their relationship continued. In fact, Giselle would often visit him and write letters to him. She was under the false belief that the abuse would stop once he got out of jail, but this was far from accurate. After he was released in October 2010, fights occurred almost every day despite Giselle being under a protective order. However, it seemed she didn't want to get him in trouble. Neighbors would often call the police when they heard them fighting, and she would allow him to hide before they arrived. He was found hiding on 2 separate occasions and faced jail time. In July of 2011, he was once again let out after Giselle modified the protective order to allow peaceful contact. Later that August, Giselle found out she was pregnant with William's child. However, this did not stop him from being violent towards her. Over the next few months, there were a total of 5 brutal beatings that she received from him. However, he said if she ever called the police again, he would kill her. Family soon noticed that whenever Giselle was with William, her demeanor would seem to change. She would become quiet, unresponsive, and fearful. However, they still married that November, only a day before their son was born. After this point, he became controlling of every aspect of her life. He would become suspicious of any phone calls she made, assuming she was talking about him to her family or the police. However, after all the abuse that she had to endure, everything would come to a climax that Christmas of 2011. It was Christmas morning at around 1 a.m., and neighbors claimed to hear the couple once again arguing as usual. The bickering was then suddenly stopped by the sound of a loud bang. Giselle had accidentally fallen over and hit her head extremely hard on a glass coffee table, which shattered upon impact. Tragically, she had died. For hours, William repeatedly tried to resuscitate her, but to no avail. Once the children had awoken to open presents that morning, William simply propped up Giselle's stiff and lifeless body onto the couch and placed a pair of sunglasses onto her. He told the children, quote, "Mommy ruined Christmas. She got drunk and ruined Christmas." He had them open their presents while unknowingly their deceased mom watched over right behind them. At around 9 a.m., William began to call Giselle's relatives, telling them what occurred and that he accidentally killed her. Police would soon be called for them to investigate the apartment. When questioned by relatives, William claimed he only tossed her around a bit during the argument and had no intention of actually killing her. However, upon an autopsy examination, things were not adding up. They couldn't pinpoint one single injury that would have resulted in her death. There were so many injuries to her head and body that it would have been almost impossible for it to have only occurred from the fall. And surprisingly, there were no cuts on her upper back, which would be expected if she had fallen into a glass table. There were at least 4 blunt force injuries to her head and a laceration above her right eye. The injuries to her face, head, and body appeared to have been inflicted upon her rather than occurring because of the fall. William Wallace was arrested and convicted of second-degree murder. In 2021, nearly a decade after Zizel's death, he was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. The death of Zizel Preston is sickening given how relentless her husband was to inflict pain on her, keeping her in a constant state of fear. If there's one thing you can take away from this story, it's to learn from Zizel's mistake. If you ever find yourself in an abusive relationship, leave that person immediately, because they won't stop no matter how much they try to convince you. They see you as something to be owned, and will do everything they can to control and possess you. May Zizel rest in peace, and her family learn to move on from what this horrible man put them through. The story begins with a 45-year-old man named Bruce Pardo. Bruce Pardo was described as an outgoing and friendly man by everyone at the Holy Redeemer Catholic Church, where he often volunteered as an usher. He was a person who always found himself at the center of attention, who was easily able to hold a conversation and engage those around him. In January 2006, he married a woman named Sylvia Ortega, and the two led a happy relationship for a while. They moved into a large home in Montrose, California, and owned a Cadillac Escalade, a Hummer, and even their own boat, so they appeared to be pretty well off. However, things began to go sour when they started having arguments over finances. Bruce worked as an electrical engineer at a military contractor and was easily bringing in 6 figures, but the problem lay in how this money was shared. Sylvia, who was a single mother of 3 when they got married, worked as a secretary at a flower nursery and made nowhere near as much as Bruce did. However, he refused to open a joint bank account for them to share the money and insisted that Sylvia use her money to care for her own children. By the end of their first year of marriage, Bruce became a cold and distant person, and worst of all, money hungry, which often led to arguments. It turned out that Bruce had always been a terrible person when it came to money. In a prior engagement to a coworker in 1989, they planned this huge, expensive wedding which largely came from his fiance's finances, and once they opened their joint bank account to pool their shares, he stole all the money from their account and ditched their wedding to go on a trip to Palm Springs. While this already shows a huge lack of morals from Bruce, what Sylvia would learn about him later on in their marriage is nothing short of disturbing. In a previous relationship, Bruce actually had a child that he never disclosed to Sylvia until she eventually found out. But that's not all. About 5 years prior, Bruce had been watching the then 13-month-old boy while his mother Elena went shopping. Irresponsibly, Bruce watched TV, not keeping a careful eye on his son, which caused him to fall into the pool outside. When Elena came home, Bruce was screaming uncontrollably, holding the boy in his arms. It took hours of resuscitation to stabilize the child, and a few weeks later, doctors determined he suffered severe brain damage, and instead of dealing with his error like a man, he broke off his relationship to Elena, leaving her to raise her now disabled son by herself. Even when she needed help to pay the $350,000 medical bill, he refused to lend a hand, leading her to sue his homeowner's insurance, which led to a settlement of less than 1/3 of what the bills were. He never paid a single cent in child support, but the icing on the cake is although cutting off all ties with his family, he still illegally declared his son as a dependent on his taxes, allowing tax deductions for himself without actually having to be in his child's life. Upon learning this, Sylvia couldn't help but see her husband as a monster, and she didn't want to be liable for the tax fraud he was still continuing to commit. They began sleeping in separate beds until they eventually decided to end the relationship. However, Sylvia still asked Bruce if she could continue living in the home until the end of the school year so her daughter could finish kindergarten. But while she and her daughter were at a relative's birthday one day, he threw their belongings out onto the driveway. This was the last straw for Sylvia to file for divorce. In June of 2008, the divorce process began, and the court ordered Bruce to pay Sylvia $1,700 a month in alimony. He did this for 1 month and then completely stopped after the second check. That same month of June marked a dark descent into madness for Bruce, and the events that follow are nothing short of terrifying. A month later, Bruce was fired from his job, which allowed him to get out of his alimony, but he was still in credit card debt and was now making zero income. This didn't stop him from purchasing 5 9mm Sig Sauer handguns with illegal extended magazines over the coming months. He also picked up a Santa suit near November. By this point, it's clear Bruce was about to carry out a diabolical plan. To add fuel to the flame, on December 18, 2008, the divorce was finalized, which allowed him to keep his house, but he was ordered to pay Sylvia 10 grand while she was also able to keep her expensive engagement ring and the family dog. Then, only about a week later, on Christmas Eve night, Bruce crossed a line of no return. Sylvia's family were at a Christmas Eve party that night in Covina, California, where Bruce knew he could catch them off guard. He put on his Santa suit and drove to the small cul-de-sac neighborhood in a blue Dodge Caliber. Looking totally inconspicuous, waving to neighbors and passers-by, he approached the Ortega's home at around 11:30 with a large gift-wrapped box. He knocked on the door and 8-year-old Katrina Józef-Polski rushed to let him in. Upon entering, she was immediately shot in the face. He ran inside of the house, guns drawn in both hands, shooting every partygoer he could see. He then opened the large gift-wrapped box and pulled out a homemade flamethrower, which he used to spray a high-octane fuel mixture inside of the house. He planned to ignite the mixture when he left, but what he didn't realize is there were already open flames inside of the house. The fireplaces caused an explosion, resulting in flames as high as 50 feet in the air. Bruce suffered third-degree burns and fled the house as fast as he could. Thankfully, not everyone in attendance perished in the fire. The 8-year-old he shot in the face did manage to escape, as well as a 16-year-old girl he shot in the back and another woman who jumped from the second-story window. When firefighters arrived, it took them 2 hours to put out the enormous flames. Afterwards, investigators discovered 9 heavily charred bodies in the ruins of the home who could only be identified by their dental records, revealing Bruce killed Sylvia, her mother and father, 2 of her brothers, 3 of her sisters, and her nephew. The surviving family members were able to tell police exactly what happened and that Bruce Pardo was the man they were looking for. It didn't take long to find him either. 3 hours later, Bruce's brother Brad, who returned from a Christmas party, came home to find his brother lying in a pool of blood on his couch. He died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He immediately called the police, and what they soon found made this case so much worse. Parked outside Brad's house was Bruce's blue Dodge Caliber, which law enforcement found rigged with a bomb. After safely detonating it, inside they found the burnt Santa suit and thousands of rounds of ammunition. Bruce was planning much more than what occurred that night, and it seems he only unalived himself because of the physical pain he was in. Shortly after, Pasadena police received a call from Sylvia's divorce attorney named Nord, whom Bruce also had a grudge against. He reported a suspicious-looking vehicle outside of his home, and when police arrived to investigate inside the silver Toyota, they found various items belonging to Bruce. Supplies indicating he planned to go on a long road trip, including maps of the US and Mexico, food, water, and computers. His original plan was to carry out the massacre at the Ortega house, drive the bomb-rigged vehicle through the divorce attorney's home and detonate it, while using the parked Toyota as a getaway vehicle. Later evidence also revealed a sinister plan to kill his own mother, which was motivated by his belief that she took his wife's side during the divorce. It's an overall tragic and disturbing story that was birthed from a man's disgusting pride and vengeance. Bruce Pardo destroyed a family that night, and I think we can all agree that his death is the best way that this could have played out, preventing him from hurting more innocent people due to his own sick grudges. The story begins with a man named Ronald Gene Simmons. Ronald was born on July 15, 1940 in Chicago, Illinois, to Loretta and William Simmons. When he was only 3 years old, his father died of a stroke, causing his mother to remarry, this time to William D. Griffin, a civil engineer for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The Corps ended up moving to Little Rock, Arkansas, causing William to move his family there and bounce across the state multiple times. By the time Ronald was 17, he dropped out of high school to pursue the U.S. Navy. He was first stationed at the Bremerton Naval Base in Washington, where he would meet his soon-to-be wife, Bersabe Ulibarri, who he would marry in July of 1960. Over the next 18 years, the couple had 7 children together, whilst Ronald also made several achievements in the military, earning a Bronze Star, the Republic of Vietnam Cross for his service as an airman, and the Air Force Ribbon for excellent marksmanship. He retired on November 30th, 1979 at the rank of Master Sergeant. Although Ronald seemed to be just a rugged, hard-working man, evidence would soon come to light that he had intentions way past the line of depraved. He and his family initially lived in Cloudcroft, New Mexico, where town locals often referred to Ronald as a person to be feared. He was a drunk who largely stayed in one dark room of his home, drinking his life away, and was an overall unfriendly person, which would become an understatement once the allegations came out. He was reported for having sexual relations with his own daughter, Sheila, who was 17 at the time. People recalled seeing him being way too friendly with her, and once she admitted that she was pregnant with his baby, charges were filed against him. However, to avoid this, he moved along with his family to Russellville, Arkansas in 1981, and the charges were soon dropped. Whilst here, he worked a string of low-paying jobs where he soon earned a notorious reputation as well. Numerous reports were filed against Ronald, claiming he made inappropriate advances towards women on the job. In light of these allegations, he soon quit working on December 18, 1987. By this point, his wife had already left him on numerous occasions for his behavior, but for some unknown reason, she returned back to him every time, which would prove to be a dire mistake, because that Christmas season, Ronald began to snap, devising a horrible plan to kill every one of his family members. On the 22nd of December, Ronald went down to his local Walmart and purchased a .22 caliber handgun, and he immediately went home to his family. He first bludgeoned and shot his son Gene, before doing the same to his long-suffering wife Bersabe. He then strangled his 3-year-old daughter Barbara. While this was all occurring, it was early in the day, so the rest of his children were still at school, completely unaware of what he's just done. He used this time to take a break and have a beer, before dumping their bodies into a cesspit his children dug months prior. Later, the Dover school bus dropped off the 4 younger Simmons children who were just about to go on Christmas break. They were Loretta, Eddie, Marianne, and Becky. He told them that he had presents to give them, but he wanted to give it to each of them separately. It's believed they were separated over multiple parts of the house and killed in similar ways, by strangulation or by drowning in a rain barrel. He then used the same cesspit to bury the next 4 children. He spent that Christmas alone, likely drinking heavily as he usually did, because by this point he had now murdered everyone in his main household. But the massacre was far from over. Ronald invited his older children, who were now adults, to an after-Christmas dinner. First to arrive was his son Billy, along with his wife Renata and their 20-month-old son Trey. Upon arrival, the pair were immediately shot point blank and hidden by the dining table underneath some coats and bedding before Ronald turned to the child and drowned him inside of a rain barrel. He was hidden inside the trunk of a car behind Ronald's home. Next to arrive was Ronald's now 24-year-old daughter Sheila, the daughter who he'd been abusing in the past, along with her 33-year-old husband Dennis, as well as their children 7-year-old Sylvia and 20-month-old Michael. And once again, when they entered the house, he showed no hesitation. Sheila and Dennis were immediately shot before he moved on to strangle their 2 children. He then hid their bodies across several areas of the home. By this point, Ronald had now killed 14 people in the span of 2 days, all of which were his family, including women and children. But still, his rampage was not over, as he now planned to kill others outside his family who he believed wronged him in some way. On Monday, December 28th, 2 days later, Ronald drove again to a local Walmart and purchased a second gun from the store. Immediately after, he stopped at the Peel, Eddy, and Gibbons law firm, where he shot dead Secretary Kathy Kendrick, who for some reason he blamed for a number of his problems. He then left the building and drove to Taylor Oil Company, where he shot and wounded Russell Taylor, who was the owner of the Sinclair Mini Mart he once worked at, and killed J.D. Chaffin, a fireman and part-time truck driver for the oil company. He shot and missed another individual before exiting the building and driving to the Sinclair Mini Mart, where he shot and injured employees Roberta Woolery and David Slayer. After this, he drove to his last location, the Woodline Motor Freight Company, where he shot and wounded his former supervisor, Joyce Butts, before taking worker Vicky Jackson at gunpoint into the computer office and advised her to call the police. He allegedly told her, quote, "I've come to do what I wanted to do. It's all over now. I've gotten everybody who wanted to hurt me." He surrendered as soon as the Russellville police arrived. He was immediately sent to Arkansas State Hospital for a competency evaluation, where he was found capable to stand trial. He was later convicted on May 12, 1988 for the deaths of Kathy Kendrick and J.D. Chaffin, and soon after sentenced to death by lethal injection plus 147 years. Ronald refused all rights to appeal his sentence. At a later date, on February 10, 1989, Ronald was also found guilty of 14 counts of capital murder and the deaths of his family. A prosecuting attorney tried to give a possible motive for his crimes after presenting an undated note which looked to be addressed to his daughter Sheila. He said it indicated a strong love-hate relationship between Ronald and his daughter. The judge then ruled this motive admissible, which caused Ronald to lash out at the attorney, punch him in the face, and then unsuccessfully attempt to steal a deputy's handgun. He was immediately rushed out of the room. Ronald was again sentenced to death by lethal injection on March 16, 1989, to which he refused his right to appeal once again. His execution took place on June 25, 1990. His body was never claimed, and he was buried in Popper's Plot at Lincoln Memorial Lawn in Varner. The crimes of Ronald Gene Simmons across those short few days became known as the worst mass murder in the history of Arkansas. May every one of those 16 people whose lives were taken rest in peace, while Ronald rots in hell for the relentless pain and suffering he inflicted upon others.